Every single meal you've ever eaten exists because of one massive turning point in human history: fire. Before that, humans were eating everything completely raw, and honestly, that sounds like a nightmare. So today we're going through how humans have actually cooked and eaten food throughout every era of history. And trust me, some of these methods are way weirder and honestly way grosser than anything on your dinner table right now. Let's get into it. Let's start at the very beginning. Before cooking existed at all, early humans were eating raw meat, raw plants, whatever they could find or catch, completely unprocessed. And this actually limited humans in a massive way, because raw food takes way more energy for your body to digest, which means less energy left over for literally everything else, including brain development. Then, at some point, likely at least 1 million years ago, based on burnt bone evidence found at sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, humans figured out how to control fire. And once cooking entered the picture, everything changed. Cooking food breaks it down before it even hits your stomach, which means your body absorbs way more calories and nutrients from the exact same food. Some anthropologists actually argue that cooking is one of the biggest reasons human brains got so much bigger than other primates, because suddenly there was way more usable energy available to fuel brain growth. So next time someone says cooking is just a hobby, you can remind them it's literally the reason humans have the brains to have that conversation at all. Early cooking was about as basic as it gets, just throwing meat directly onto open flames, no seasoning, no technique, nothing. But it didn't stay that simple for long. Archaeological evidence shows that by around 30,000 years ago, humans in parts of Europe were grinding up plant roots and cooking them into a primitive flatbread, which honestly makes this one of the earliest known baked goods in human history. So somewhere out there, a caveman was making bread tens of thousands of years before bakeries existed, and he definitely didn't get credit for it. Around this same broad window of prehistory, early humans were also figuring out fermentation almost entirely by accident. Fruit left sitting too long, grains soaked in water and forgotten, both naturally start fermenting on their own. And it's very likely that early humans discovered alcohol this way, completely by accident, long before anyone intentionally set out to brew anything. Now let's talk about the Bronze Age, because this is where cooking starts becoming an actual structured part of daily life instead of just survival. Pottery had already been invented, and this changed food completely, because now humans could boil, stew, and store food instead of just roasting everything over open fire. Boiling in particular was a huge deal, because it let people cook tougher foods, extract more nutrients from bones and vegetables, and make things like broths and soups that just weren't possible before. In Mesopotamia, we actually have some of the oldest known written recipes in human history, recorded on clay tablets dating back to around 1750 BC. These recipes include stews made with meat, vegetables, and, weirdly enough, blood, used as a thickening agent, similar to how people still make blood sausage today. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, bread and beer became absolutely central to daily life. So central that workers building the pyramids were often partially paid in bread and beer rations instead of money. So technically, some of history's most impressive architecture was built by people getting paid in carbs and alcohol, which honestly sounds like a pretty reasonable deal. Over in ancient China during this same broad era, food culture was developing in a completely different and genuinely fascinating direction. The concept of balancing flavors, sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and what's often described as savory or umami, was already being deliberately studied and applied to cooking thousands of years ago, which is honestly more sophisticated than a lot of food theory used today. Rice cultivation was also becoming absolutely central to daily life across the region, and cooking techniques like steaming, which required specifically designed pottery, were already well established. This is also roughly the era where fermented soybean products, early ancestors of things like soy sauce, started appearing, adding an entirely different flavor dimension that would go on to influence cuisine across the entire region for thousands of years afterward. Moving into the Iron Age, trade routes started expanding dramatically, and with that came something huge for cooking: spices. The ability to season food beyond just salt completely transformed cuisine across multiple civilizations. In China, iron cooking woks started appearing, allowing for faster, high-heat cooking methods that are honestly still recognizable in modern stir-fry cooking today. Meanwhile, ancient Rome developed an incredibly complex food culture, with entire cookbooks being written, the most famous being attributed to a guy named Apicius. And Roman cuisine got wild. We're talking about dishes using exotic ingredients like flamingo, dormice, which were actually farmed specifically for eating, and a fermented fish sauce called garum that was used almost like ketchup, except it was made by letting fish guts rot in the sun for weeks. Romans put that on basically everything, and honestly, once you know that, ketchup doesn't sound so bad anymore. Now let's jump into the medieval era, because food during this period is a genuinely wild mix of extreme luxury and extreme survival, often existing at the exact same time in the exact same country. For wealthy nobles, elaborate feasts were a massive display of status, sometimes involving dishes like peacock or swan, served with the feathers reattached afterward purely for visual drama. Meanwhile, for most regular peasants, food was primarily grain-based, usually in the form of thick porridge or dense bread, sometimes bulked out with literally anything available, including sawdust during particularly bad famine years, which is genuinely one of the darker facts on this entire list. Spices during this era became an absolutely massive luxury symbol in Europe, and we're talking valuable enough that pepper was sometimes used as a form of currency to pay rent or settle debts. This demand for spices was actually one of the major driving forces behind European exploration, which we'll get to in a second, because people were willing to sail across entire oceans just to get their hands on cinnamon and nutmeg. Also during this period, monasteries became major centers of food preservation techniques, brewing beer, aging cheese, and curing meats, largely because monks needed reliable food sources that could last through long winters without spoiling. Which brings us to the Age of Exploration, an era that's honestly defined almost entirely by food, even though it doesn't always get framed that way. European explorers weren't just looking for new land, they were specifically hunting for direct spice trade routes to Asia, because the existing routes were controlled by middlemen who jacked up prices massively. This exact motivation is what led Columbus to sail west in 1492, and even though he obviously didn't find the spice route he was looking for, he stumbled into something that changed food forever anyway. The Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of crops between the Americas and the rest of the world starting in the late 1400s and early 1500s, is honestly one of the most underrated events in food history. Tomatoes, potatoes, corn, and chili peppers all originated in the Americas and didn't exist anywhere else on Earth before this. Just take a second to think about that. Italian food without tomatoes, Irish food without potatoes, Indian and Thai food without chili peppers. None of that existed before this specific moment in history. Cuisines that feel ancient and deeply traditional today are actually built on ingredients that are only a few hundred years old in those regions, which honestly reframes a huge chunk of what we think of as classic traditional food. Right around this same broad period and continuing shortly after, two other ingredients were quietly reshaping the entire world in a completely different way: coffee and tea. Coffee is believed to have originated in Ethiopia, spreading through the Islamic world before reaching Europe by the 1600s, where coffee houses quickly became major social and business hubs, functioning almost like the offices and social media of their time. Tea followed a somewhat similar path from China, eventually becoming so central to British culture that it triggered actual historical events, including, yes, the Boston Tea Party, which was literally a protest specifically about tea taxation. It's genuinely wild that two simple hot beverages ended up tangled into major political and economic history on a global scale. Now let's talk about the Industrial Revolution, because this era changes food faster than almost any other period in human history. Canning was invented in the early 1800s, originally developed specifically to feed Napoleon's army, since the French government literally offered a cash prize to anyone who could figure out a reliable way to preserve food for troops on long military campaigns. A guy named Nicolas Appert won that prize, and canning quickly spread from military use into regular households. Then, in the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur developed pasteurization, a heating process that killed harmful bacteria in food and drinks, especially milk, which dramatically reduced food-related illness and death. Meanwhile, industrial food processing exploded during this era. Factories could now mass-produce flour, sugar, and canned goods at a scale that simply wasn't possible before, which made food dramatically cheaper and more available to regular working-class people, not just the wealthy. And then in 1876, the first practical refrigeration system started being used for large-scale food transport, meaning meat and produce could travel much longer distances without spoiling, which completely reshaped what people in cities could actually eat on a regular basis. Now here's a genuinely strange little chapter in food history that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Prohibition in the United States, starting in 1920, banned the sale of alcohol nationwide, and this ended up reshaping food culture in some pretty unexpected ways. Speakeasies, illegal bars operating in secret, needed to disguise themselves as something else entirely, and a lot of them did this by operating as restaurants or soda shops on the surface, quietly serving alcohol in teacups or coffee mugs to avoid suspicion if anyone glanced over. Cocktail culture actually exploded during this era too, somewhat ironically, because bootleg alcohol often tasted pretty rough, so bartenders started mixing it with fruit juices, sugar, and other flavorings specifically to mask the harsh taste, which is a big part of why so many classic cocktails from this exact era are so sweet. Prohibition eventually got repealed in 1933, but a huge chunk of cocktail culture that exists today can trace its roots directly back to bartenders trying to disguise bad homemade liquor. Now let's get into the modern era, because this is where food culture starts moving at an absolutely insane pace. In 1921, White Castle opened, widely considered the first fast food chain in America, and it completely restructured how quickly and cheaply people could eat. Then, in 1954, Swanson introduced the TV dinner, a fully pre-made frozen meal designed to be eaten in front of a television, which honestly perfectly captures the entire direction food convenience was heading in during this era. The mid-1900s also brought the widespread adoption of home refrigerators and freezers, meaning regular families could finally store fresh food for extended periods without relying on ice deliveries or immediate consumption, which sounds basic today but was a genuinely massive quality of life shift at the time. Then fast food chains exploded globally throughout the second half of the century, McDonald's, KFC, and countless others spreading across entire continents and fundamentally reshaping global eating habits in just a few decades. And now, in the present day, we're seeing an entirely new set of food innovations. Lab-grown meat, created directly from animal cells without needing to raise or slaughter an actual animal, has already received regulatory approval for sale in multiple countries. Plant-based meat alternatives have become mainstream enough to sit right next to regular meat in most major grocery stores. And global food delivery apps now let you order food from restaurants around your entire city and have it arrive at your door within minutes, something that would have sounded like pure science fiction just a couple decades ago. So when you look at this whole timeline side by side, some pretty clear patterns start showing up. Sometimes food technology exists purely out of necessity, like early humans discovering fire simply to survive. Sometimes it's about preservation and distance, like canning being invented specifically to feed an army on the move, or refrigeration allowing food to travel further than ever before. Sometimes it's about status and luxury, like spices being worth more than actual currency during the medieval era. And sometimes, like with the Columbian Exchange or Prohibition, a single historical event doesn't just change one dish or one drink, it completely rewrites entire food and drinking cultures that we now consider ancient and untouchable traditions. What's genuinely wild is that so much of what we consider deeply traditional, deeply cultural food is actually way younger than most people assume, built on ingredients, techniques, and technologies that are constantly being reshaped by whatever's happening in the wider world at the time. Every cuisine you think of as timeless was at some point brand new, weird, and probably controversial to somebody. Which honestly makes you wonder what your favorite meal right now is eventually going to look like 100 years from now, and whether some future version of this channel is going to be making a video about how ridiculous it was that we used to eat things completely unprocessed, straight out of a plastic bag. Anyway, that's how humans have actually cooked and eaten food throughout every major era of history. Let me know which era you want a full deep dive on. No cap, that's the file. Catch you next time.